Okay, I thought that I would go over this sheet with you that we did in class that some of you really struggled with and see where we're struggling. So the first part I think you guys were okay with. It was just matching each of the fractions with the decimal component. 7/8 is one of your benchmarks, so that one you should know right away is 875 thousandths. Why should you know that? Because you've memorized it from your flip book that we just did. And if you don't know what flip book I'm talking about, look at the other video with the conversions and it'll explain everything. For 19/20, 20th is not a benchmark, so that's one we're going to have to figure out. Well, remember, I have to get to a 10, 100, or thousandth. I'm already past the 10. I know 20 goes into 100 pretty easily. So I'm going to multiply times 5. Whatever I do to the bottom, I do to the top, which would give me 95 hundredths. And in a decimal form, that would match E. For 7/25, again, that's not a benchmark, but I know because of my fourths that dealt with quarters, I do know that it takes 4 quarters to get $1. So I'm going to multiply the bottom by 4, which means I have to multiply the top by 4, which gives me 28 hundredths, which matches A in decimal form. For number 4, 3/5 is a benchmark. That one's easy because I know that if I multiply times 2, I get 10, and whatever I do to the bottom, I have to do to the top. I get 6/10. 6/10 in decimal form matches C. So we just have one left with no answer. The second section, and I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so we can see that a little bit easier. The second section looked for equivalents. It said write the decimal equivalent, and I think that's where some of you may have had trouble is, I don't know if you were writing fraction equivalents, but they were specifically looking for decimal equivalents. Let me just get this a little bit more clear. Okay, the first one is 2/5. So for a decimal equivalent, I need to get to 10, 100, or 1,000. So we're going to multiply by 2 because 10 is closest. And then I get 4/10. Remember it said decimal. So I need to change that to a decimal, and I just write it in the tenths place. The next one is 1/8. Well, that is a benchmark. I'm supposed to know that one immediately. So I'm not even going to have to do any math for that. I know that my benchmark for 1/8 is 125 thousandths. Again, 7/20, 20th is not a benchmark, but I know I need to get to 100, so I'm going to multiply it by 5, and I get 35 hundredths. But remember they said decimal equivalent, so I need to transfer that and convert that to a decimal. So that would be decimal 35. And number 8 is 2/25. Again, 25 is not a benchmark, but I know that it takes 4 quarters to get to 100, so I'm going to times by 4, whatever I do to the bottom, I do to the top, and I get 8 hundredths. I'm looking for a decimal, so to write 8 hundredths, I put a decimal, 0.8, because my 8 needs to sit in the hundredths spot. Be careful not to put it in the tenths spot, because that would not be correct. Number 9 says 3/4. 3/4 is one of my benchmarks. I should know right away that that is 75 hundredths without even thinking about it. 13/25. Remember, 25 is not a benchmark, but I know it takes 4 quarters to make $1. So I'm going to multiply by 4, and I get 52 hundredths. But that is not a decimal, so I need to change it and convert it into a decimal. So I'd put decimal 52. 39/50. 50 is not a benchmark, but look how close 50 is to 100. All I have to do is multiply by 2. Whatever I do to the top, I'm going to do to the bottom, and vice versa. I get 78 hundredths. That is not a decimal, so I need to convert it to one. So I get decimal 78. And then 17/40. 40 is not a benchmark, but when I try to find if it's a 10, no, obviously not, it goes past. But then if I were to try to get to 100, it's not going to land directly on 100. This actually converts all the way to, has to go to 1,000, which is times 25. And you have to think, 40 times 25, well, that makes sense because 4 times 25 is 100, and add your 0, that would be 1,000. And whatever I do to the bottom, I have to do the top. So I end up with 425 thousandths. That is not a decimal, so I need to write it as one, and I put 425 thousandths. Okay, the next section is really where I think a lot of you made mistakes, is because it specifically said you need to write an equivalent fraction, which you did fine on, but then it said simplest form, and we talked about in class what is simplest form mean. That means reduce it all the way down and you get the smallest form of that fraction. So 13 we did together, and we converted 3/10 from a decimal into 3/10 that's a fraction, and we talked about how that was already in its simplest form, so there's nothing else for us to do. 78 hundredths, however, is different. We have to convert it first to a decimal. We have 78 over 100. Now I can find simplest form two different ways. I can find my greatest common factor and divide it, or I could do a prime factorization tree and get rid of anything that I have in common. So I know that the GCF of 78 and 100 is 2, so I'm going to divide the top by 2 and the bottom by 2, because the same rule applies. Whatever you do to the top, you have to do to the bottom. And I get 39/50ths. If I would have done that and still been able to reduce my fraction, I would still need to reduce it more. We need it to get as small as it can. And that's why some of you like to use prime factorization, is it just assures you that you make sure that you're getting the smallest form. So 15 is 65 hundredths. So first write it in a fraction, and then we need to reduce. The greatest common factor between these two numbers is 5. And so if I divide by 5, I end up with 13/20ths, and that's my simplest form. For 32 hundredths, first let's write a fraction. My greatest common factor is 4. So I divide that and I get 8/25ths. Okay, number 17 is 25 thousandths. So I'm going to first start with my fraction. And this one you should be able to see 25. Well, 25 goes into 100, so 25 surely can go into 1,000. So I'm actually going to divide by 25. And I'm going to be left with 1/40th. 5 thousandths, same idea. I should be able to see that 5 will divide into 1,000 because I know my divisibility rules, that ends in a 0. So I'm going to divide it by 5, and I'll get 1/200. The next one is 48 hundredths. I'm going to divide by 4, and I will get 12/25ths, and that is my simplest form. And then the last one, 75 thousandths. You should be able to recognize that 25 will go into both of these, and you're left with 3/40ths. So that's where simplest form comes in. Okay, next section is comparing, and we did the first one together. First, you need those numbers to either both be decimal or both fraction. For me, I'm going to make this into both of them decimal because 5/8 is my benchmark, so without doing any work, I can automatically write my benchmark. Now, this one goes into the thousandths place, 625 thousandths. This one is 58 hundredths. I'm going to add a 0 on this side just so that they are both using the same place value. That way I can just look at my number and look at 580 and 625. Which one's bigger, which one's smaller? 580 would be less than 625, which means 580 thousandths would be less than 625 thousandths. 22 is 17 fiftieths and 34 hundredths. I'm going to make it into a decimal again because 50 is so close to 100. I know that all I have to do is multiply by 2, and I get 34 over 100. Well, if I write that like a decimal, I notice 34 hundredths, they are equivalent. And the next one is 615 thousandths and 615. Well, that sounds the same, but this one ended in a thousandths, this one ended in a 15. So I'm actually going to reduce this because I'm close to 10. So 3, if I divide by 3, I get 2/5. Well, 2/5 is the same as 4/10. 4/10 is a decimal. And this is 615 thousandths. Okay, tenths and thousandths I don't like. I'm going to add a 0 and a 0. I'm not adding any value, but I'm just adding so that the place values sound the same. So 615 thousandths, 400 thousandths. Then I can look at it as 615 and 400. Which one's greater? 615 thousandths is greater than 400 thousandths. And the next part we did ordering from least to greatest. And I told you I like to put that big L, arrow, and G, because how many times do we start working a problem and totally forget that we're going least to greatest and flip-flop the two? So again, you have three numbers. They either need to all be fractions or all be decimals. I'm going to do decimals because if I do fractions, not only do I have to convert these to fractions, but then all my denominators have to be the same. So I'm going to just convert by multiplying by 2, and I get 8/10. Well, then my decimal is 8. These both go into the hundredths place, so I'm just going to add a 0, so that one goes into the hundredths place as well. Least, now I can just look at my numbers like 80, 85, 45. Well, least would be 45 hundredths. Next, 80 hundredths. And my greatest is 85 hundredths. So 25, I'm going to convert to decimals for the same reason. I don't want to have to go back and get a common denominator. So 3/8 I should automatically know that's a benchmark. That should be 375 thousandths. 3/4 is also a benchmark. That should be 75 hundredths. Well, now I have a tenth, thousandths, and a hundred. I'm going to add a 0 so that goes into the thousandths. I'm going to add 2 zeros so that goes into the thousandths. Now I'm looking for least to greatest. So least 700, 375, or 750. So my least is 375 thousandths, followed by 700 thousandths, followed by 750 thousandths. And my last one, again, I'm going to convert them all to decimals. So 3/20ths is easy just because I'm real close to 100. Multiply by 5, multiply by 5, 15 hundredths. And then I need to write it into a decimal. I'm running out of room. 15 hundredths, 32 hundredths. Well, 1/5, I just multiply by 2. I get 2/10, but all these guys are in hundredths, so I'm going to add a 0, not adding any value, just changing the place. So now I can look at it like 15, 32, and 20, which one is least. My 15 hundredths, followed by 20 hundredths, and last is 32 hundredths. The last part, which fraction of the landfill is occupied by papers, they're talking about our paper products are 225 thousandths. Our glass is 11/50ths. So what fraction is occupied by paper? Well, they gave us the decimal of 225 thousandths. We're just going to put it into a fraction, 225 thousandths. Where glass, they're asking, how would you write that as a decimal? Well, I have 11/50ths. I don't have a place value that's called 50ths, so I can't write it as a decimal yet. But I can multiply it by 2 to get to 100. And it would be 22 hundredths as a decimal. 22 hundredths. Which product occupies more of the landfill? Oh, that's too close. Okay. Now, I'm going to look at my decimals. I don't like this one because it's not even. So now I'm looking at 225 and 220. Which one occupies more? That's going to be your paper products. Because there's 225 thousandths.